Hi everyone, my name is Dominic Arojado. I'm a web developer, and these are your guides, tips, and tricks to web development. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to build a URL shortener application with NestJS and using Postgres as your database. You also learn how to write end-to-end tests using Jest and super tests. And in my previous video, I showed you how to set up a local development for NestJS. We'll be using that in this video as well. So if you want to learn more about the details of that setup, you can watch that video first. But if you're now ready to start learning how to build applications in NestJS, let's go ahead and start. So I'm actually pretty new in NestJS. This is my way of, improving my skills in NestJS, and I hope we can learn together as we build this application. So let's go ahead and start. All right. So a couple of assumptions right here is that you have some sort of server-side application background and basic knowledge regarding NPM, Yarn, JavaScript, TypeScript, Docker. We'll also be using Docker for throughout the development lifecycle, and we'll also be using Node.js, NestJS, TypeORM, and Postgres. So although you are new to NestJS, that's fine. I'll be teaching you some of the basics of NestJS and some of the concepts around it. And yeah, we'll also be using Postgres, so you should have some sort of knowledge regarding Postgres. So you also should make sure that Yarn is installed in your system, as well as Docker Desktop. Because we'll be using Docker, you need the Docker Desktop running in the background. All right, so I'll be using Visual Studio Code for my IDE because I'm going to utilize a few extensions in their marketplace. And we'll also be using Postman to interact with our API. All right, so to quickly get started, I have the local development setup that I mentioned earlier. You just have to clone this and go to the, just have to make this bigger. So this clone using that boilerplate that I created. And let's name this as NestJS Postgres URL shortener. So I already did this before, so I don't have to run this. So once you have cloned it, I want you to open it in your Visual Studio Code. All right. So once you install it, you want to install the packages. This is basically to remove any errors while you write code for TypeScript purposes. Once you install those dependencies, make sure your Docker desktop is running, and let's run one of the scripts from the package.json. So if you look at the package.json, there's a couple of unique scripts that I created based on this boilerplate. Let's run the Docker compose dev. So if it's your first time running this, it will take some time because it will install all the dependencies and packages in an isolated environment. All right, so if you see something like this, that means that everything is working fine in this boilerplate. You can do a quick test. Let's do a quick test. Basically, it is running on port 3000. So we're going to do a request here. If we do a GET request, we should see a hello world. So that's when we know that everything is working fine. And just to give you a little bit of introduction about what this Docker compose setup is. So we have the NestJS application named as app. And then we have a database, which is the Postgres. And then we have the DB admin, which is basically our admin panel, so that we can interact with the database with a friendlier user interface. All right, so yeah, this is already set up in this local development, so you don't have to configure anything. You can start writing code right away. So just before we start, I just want you to install a couple of extensions from VS Code. So one is here. So I already installed it in my system. This is basically to format your code as you save the file or save the changes in the file. And then another one is basically ESLint. This will help you because now our setup is also integrated with ESLint, this will help you show any errors while you type the code. So before that, I just want to show you the admin panel of pgadmin 4. So in the Docker Compose, we have the default email and password. We're going to use that to log in here. So just copy this. And now once you're logged in, you want to register your server. So you can put any name you want. I'm just going to put NestJS URL shortener. And then go to the connection tab. So what host should we put? So in the env file, we actually have the database details, so such as host, port, username, password, database. So we just have to copy the host, which is db. That's because in the Docker Compose, that's the name of the database running in isolation. And then we have the port. Database is Postgres, and username is Postgres. And we should also have a password. Let's save the password. So once we save this, so as you can see, we have the tables and the user from the default setup. So that means our connection to the database is successful. All right, so now let's do the cleanup. I want to delete the users. We don't need it. We also don't need the app controller and the app service. So delete these files. And as we delete them, we will get an error here. Let's delete this as well, because it's no longer there. All right, so our cleanup is done. Now we can proceed to the feature. So I just want to quickly show you what are the features that we'll be implementing. So first is getting all the links, and then we should be able to create a link as well. We should also be able to delete link. We should be able to update a link, redirect, which is the main or MVP feature of the URL shortener. So if you have a short link, it should redirect to the actual link. All right, so yeah, let's go ahead and implement this links feature. So in NestJS, normally we create modules. So a module in Nest is simply to organize a code relevant to that specific feature. So in this case, we'll be going to create features for links. So we need to create a module for the links which we will call LinksModule. So this will help us to keep our code organized and establish a clear boundaries based on their responsibility. So this also helps us manage complexity and develop solid principles, especially as our application or our team grows. It's easier to manage. So in NestJS, modules are singletons by default. So you can share the same instance of any provider between modules effortlessly. So that's awesome because now we can share features from other modules without having to duplicate the code. So in NestJS, you can create a module using the NestJS CLI. So if you haven't installed that globally in your system, you have to run this yarn global add NestJS CLI. So I already done this before, so I don't have to do it. And then I can just generate a module. So using the Nest CLI, NestG, which means generate module, and we'll be calling it links. So as I run this, this will basically create a file, create a folder in the file, linksmodule.ts, and then it will update the app module to basically import it under the imports array. So cool, we don't have to write code, we just have to run this command and it will do this for us. The next thing we need to do is basically create the service. So services are responsible for business logics, such as data storage and retrieval. It's designed to be used by a controller. So we'll get to the controller later on. So service is a good candidate to be defined as a provider. So what is provider in NestJS? So based from the documentation, provide us a fundamental concept in Nest. Many of the basic Nest classes may be treated as provider. So services, repository, factories, helpers, and so on. So the main idea of provider is that it can be injected as a dependency. So if, for example, controller needs to interact with a database, you inject the link service to it so that it can, interact and do the business logics. So yeah, to create a service for links, again, we will be using the NestJS CLI. Generate a service, and let's call it links. And we will pass a specific parameter, which is called no-spec. We don't want to create, basically, we won't create a test file or a spec file. Because although we'll be writing tests later on, we don't need it yet. Again, it will be create a file, LinksService.ts, and we added the link service in the providers. Great. So we just have to save this so that it removes that ESLint error using prettier as the code formatter. All right. So service will be the one to interact mostly with the database. So I want to take this opportunity to introduce to you TypeORM. So TypeORM is basically an ORM. So in this case, TypeORM helps us develop any kind of application that uses a database in a JavaScript or TypeScript friendly way. So instead of using plain queries directly. So for example, if you're using Postgres, you're not going to be sending select star from table. We'll be using a JavaScript function to do that. So not only that, it can also handle a lot of things automatically, such as database handling, data types, relations, etc. It also has data abstraction, and they support a number of databases. So for example, today we're using Postgres. You can easily switch to MongoDB with just updating the configuration. You don't have to change any of the code that calls or queries the database, only the configuration. And that's great. So that's why we're using TypeORM in this setup. So you don't have to do anything to integrate with TypeORM. This setup is already done for you. So as you can see, we're using Postgres, and along with the database details already injected. All right. So now we need to create an entity. It's basically a term in TypeORM. So it's basically the class that maps to a database, table, or collection in MongoDB. It will help us maintain the shape of our table or collection. So in this case, the shape of our link. So that's why we'll be creating an entity under the links folder. And it's important to follow this convention .entity.ts because that's how our TypeORM is able to load that entity. As you can see, there's a configuration here, auto load entities. You'll basically look for all the entities within the code and initiate those tables or collections. So yeah, you need to follow that .entity.ts. So entities are by default class. So we need to create a link entity. So this is basically the shape of our database. So what should the link contain? It should be a string. It should have an ID of string. It should also have a name. This will be the short name to handle the redirection, and then the actual URL, so where it will be redirected. So in order to make this class an entity, we need to use the decorator, entity decorator, which is from TypeORM. So if this is your first time seeing a decorator, let me take this opportunity to explain it to you in simple words. So from NestJS documentation, decorator is an expression which returns a function and can take a target, name, and property descriptor as arguments. So you can apply a decorator with a prefix of @ placing at the very top of any class or parameter that you want to decorate. So basically, it decorates this class to become an entity. It's similar to the concept of, high order function. You take in a function and it returns you a modified function. So that's how decorators work. So I'll be adding a description below if you want to read more about decorators. And in NestJS, they utilize a lot about these decorators. It's actually not a new concept in the software development or software programming, but in the JavaScript world, this is a relatively new feature. So yeah, NestJS utilizes this decorator a lot. So you'll be seeing a lot more of the decorators as we move along with the video. So yeah, so now we wrapped it in an entity. We also need to decorate the columns or the fields of these individual keys. So for ID, we can decorate it in a primary generated column. So if it's just a column, it will not auto-generate, but we want it to be auto-generated. And we can pass a string, which basically what type of primary key we want to use. So we want it to be UUID instead of row ID. And for the name, it's just a column. But in this case, we can pass an object for the option. And we want it to be unique. So we want all of our URLs to have a unique name. We don't want two duplicate names that will cause an issue in our application. We want this to be true. And URL will just be a normal column. And that's it basically for our link entity. And this will be the shape of our link table. All right, so before we move on to writing code, I want to take this opportunity to explain two patterns in TypeORM. So there's what we call active record, and there's also what we call data mapper. So what are these two? So in this document, I'll be also adding the link in the description below. So basically for active record, you can interact with the database using your entity class. So as for the data mapper, you will create another class, what we call repositories, to do that for us. And basically, the entity just becomes like a dummy class in order to just show you the shape of the table or collection. So which one should we choose? So the decision is up to you. Basically, they have their own pros and cons. So for the data mapper, it helps with maintainability because, if you separate the responsibilities of each, it's easier to maintain that way. As for active record, when you use the entity to interact with the database, it's more simpler at the start. But, it works well with smaller applications. But if your application is larger, it's better to go for data mapper. So that's why we're choosing data mapper for our pattern. So in this case, I'm going to create a file, LinksRepository.ts, because we're going to follow the data mapper approach. So in this case, it is also a class, repository. This is just a normal class. We need to decorate it with a entity repository, and then we need to pass the entity here. All right, and we need to extend this such that it becomes a repository of the link. So this helps with the type in TypeScript. And yeah, that's all you need to do. You can straight away use this. And we need to import it in the links module so that we can use it. We're using TypeORM module. So for feature. So for root is usually used in the app module. So but links is a feature or a module. So we need to use the for feature. It accepts an array of repository that you want to use. So In this case, we only need the links repository for now. But for example, we have other repository, you can add it here. All right, so that's all we need to do. I think we're now ready to create the get all links feature. So just to remind you, we should get an array of links when we do a get request to this path right here. So how do we do that? So let's first create a function, get all links. This should be a promise because we're interacting with the database, and it should return us an array of link, link entity. So how do we do this? So we need the repository, as I mentioned earlier, to interact with the database. So in order to use that in the links service, we need to inject the dependency. So links repository in the constructor, this will be a links repository, and yep, we need to basically add links repository. Go to links repository, and this will create a TypeScript error because we need to define it here. It will be a links repository, and then this doesn't work right away. We need to use a decorator to inject the repository. Links repository. I think that is it. And let's just return repository. Fine. So this is how we query to get all the links from our links repository or links table or collection. So we can shorten this to basically don't have, as you can see, we repeated a few times. You can actually shorten this to just use the private and read-only key. And there you go. It still works as fine. So how do we use this function in the service? We actually need to create a controller. We're using NestJS CLI. I'm going to generate a controller, links. Again, no spec because we don't need the test file yet. This is going to create a file, LinksController, and it will be added as a controller in the links module. All right, so as you can see here, in the controller decorator he has a argument string links. It's basically /links to all the requests. So to handle the get request for the first feature, we can create get all links function, which is asynchronous. This should return a promise, array of links. And yeah, to inject our links service here as a dependency. So by default, because service is already handled by NestJS by default, we don't have to inject it. It's automatically ready to use by our controller. We just have to pass the type, and like we did earlier, just private read only to make it available within the class itself. So now I can use LinksService to get all links. And we need to import link entity. And there you go. And we just have to decorate this handler with depending on the type of request. So this is a get request. We need to decorate it with a get decorator from NestJS. Cool. So we're now ready to test this feature, which is to get all links. So this should literally work. So I'm already running the NestJS application using Docker compose dev. So as you can see, there's no error. So everything should be working fine. So let's do a quick test. All right, we get an array status 200 okay. That means that our feature for getting all links is working fine. Although we cannot validate yet because we need to create a link. So let's do that feature. Again, let's go back to the link service. which handles business logic to create the link. So to create a link, we need the name and the URL. And yeah, let's create the link. So using this LinksRepository to create the link, we pass in the name and the URL. So right now it doesn't create anything yet in the database. It's basically just creating the shape of the link. In order to save that in the database, we need to call LinksRepository and the function save and pass in the link right here. And now we can return the link. So just to add the type of the return, we should return a link. Now in the LinksController, we can handle that. And we need the name and the URL. All right, so same thing right here. Use the LinksService to create the link. How do we get the name and the URL? So let me do a quick test for you guys. Let's create this with a postgres. And in order to get the body from the request, we can actually just simply call the body decorator. This will be a body. Right, so let's not call LinksService yet. To show you guys, let's console the body. Let's return the body as well. Let's do a quick test on what happens. I want to know longest in the world. All right, so let's see what happens right here. As you can see, it logs the body, and you can actually use, you can pass a string of the key value, and that will return you the name. So for example, I want to get the name, I want to get the URL. Let's see what happens. All right, so once we call this, you can see it logs the name, it logs the URL. So that's how we're going to get the body or the value or the payload from the request. So now we can basically just do this and create the link. Let's see if that's working fine. All right, so now we got a special unique ID, which is from after creating the links, it will return you the unique ID. So now if we do a get request, we should see that the same link. All right, now we know that creating a link is working fine as well. Let's move on. All right, so now we can actually move this function, create link, to our repository, because you see, we can actually do a one-liner right here instead of having this in our service. So to move this to the Links repository, we can actually create a custom function. And yeah, since this is now the repository, we don't have to use the Links repository. We can just directly call the create function within this class. Great. And now we just have to update this and do Links repository, create link. And there you go. Our service is now much cleaner. We have now moved the create link in the repository, which makes more sense. Right? And yeah, as you can see from the repository, we are requiring name and URL. And then in the service, we're also requiring the name and the URL, and then we pass it to the function. And going to the controller, same thing, name URL, and then the name and URL. So you can see how many times we are referring to the name and URL within the code. So for example, if we introduce a new parameter or data within the code, we have to update this, and this just to support that one key. And that's not really ideal or efficient for maintainability. So what can we do? We can use data transfer objects. So data transfer objects is basically not specific to NestJS. It is a common concept in software development. So it is not only helpful for transferring data within processes, but also useful for data validations. So do note that DTO is not a model definition, but it helps you define the shape of the data being passed for a specific process. So for example, creating a link. So DTO, similar to model, can be defined as classes. And as per Nest documentation, it is recommended to use the classes approach. So let's go with that. So I'm going to create a folder, DTO, and add the create link.dto.ts. And this is going to be a class, as mentioned. And within the create link DTO, what is the shape of that? So it is name and URL. So name is a string, URL is also a string. And yeah, we can now straight away use this DTO within our application. So let's start with the links repository. So instead of name and URL, we have to use create link DTO, pass in the type, and extract the name and the URL from the create link DTO object. Now we will get an error in the service. Let's use create link DTO here as well. Use that type, pass in here, and lastly, create link DTO. So instead of using the body string, we just make this create link DTO and then pass in the type. All right. So this should still work fine as expected. Let's do a quick test. So I need to, since the shape of our link name needs to be unique. So let's just add a number 2 right here, see if it's worked fine. And there you go, it still works fine. If I do a get request, I now have 2 links. All right, so we're done with implementing the create link DTO. Now let's work on the feature of redirecting this name to the actual URL. So what we want to do is basically, support a wildcard path. So as you can see, after the domain, we should be able to get the link by just passing the short name. So for example, this short name, and we don't want an extra directory right here, like for example, links/short name. That makes the link slightly longer, and especially if you have a domain which is already short, we don't want it to make it longer from the directory itself. We want it to be able to redirect with just this one without the extra directory. So that's why we're not going to create that function within the links module. And you might be thinking, we probably can use app.controller to handle that. And I'm going to show you why I'm not using this one. So if we copy the app controller, not going to pass any type yet. So let's say this is the app controller. Let's just say hello world. Right, let's say we handle this in the app controller. So now this is going to be a wildcard. So anything after the slash will be handled by this controller. So what happens? So if we do a get request to the short name. We need to import this into the app. All right. What happens? Okay, so we get a hello world, which is expected because it is handling anything after the /path. You can see it still works. But now if we try to get all the links, which is /links, it will not be handled by the links controller anymore. It will be handled by the app controller, which is not ideal because we still want to get all the links from /links. We don't want to get redirected or get a 404 or get a hello world in the response. We are expecting to get all the links. So we're not going to use app controller in this case. Let me just delete that. And what I'm going to do is basically create another module called wildcard. So I think in this case, in NestJS, they work in alphabetically to create all the controllers. So in this case, W is quite far from the alphabet. So that's why it can handle all the wildcard path or path name after the links. So this will be a module. And we need a handler for this wildcard module. So let's create a controller, wildcard, and inspect. So using what we have learned is how we create a controller using the Nest CLI. All right. Create the function in the link service to basically get the link. So get link. So I can actually support name as the string, but I foresee that I'm going to use this get link when I'm updating a link. So I want to support looking for the link by its name or by its ID. So to do that, I'm going to use conditions, and the type is available from TypeORM. So find conditions and just pass the link as an argument. And this way I can call LinksRepository find one. Let's pass the conditions. Should be a promise of a link. So yeah, I can find the link by its name or by its ID. All right. So in order to use the link service in the wildcard module, wildcard controller, we need to export link service first. So in the links module, we pass in the link service in the exports. And in the wildcard module, we need to import the links module. Because in NestJS, as I mentioned earlier, modules are a singleton. So we can share the same instance to other modules and use one of their like services or repository. So now in the wildcard controller, I want to remove the string because we don't want to have another directory /wildcard. We just want the path after the slash. And then in this case, get link, we create a function, get link by name. The name of the string. This will be name of string. And yeah, we can get the link ID using the service. I forgot to inject it. We can just use LinksService as the type. And this needs to be private read only so that we can use it like this, LinksService, get link, and pass in the name. All right. So this should be a get request. So decorate it with a get decorator slash and then the wildcard name. And in order for this argument to be coming from the parameter, we can decorate this with a param decorator and then just the name. All right. So we want this to be redirected, but let's just quickly test this. See if we can find the link. So we have already created longest in the world. Let's see what happens if we try to get it. And there you go, it returns. So now we can use the URL to basically redirect our client to this URL. So how do we do that? So there's actually a response, which is from Express. Oops. And we can use the REST decorator from Nest to get this REST object. And in this REST object, there's a function called redirect. And we can pass in the status code. I want to use 301, which is a permanent redirect, and then pass in the URL. So this is a promise void. So you can do it like this, or you can just return it. That's fine. And this should be await. Okay. So now, if I go to this link, I should be redirected to this URL. So what happens is that if we do this request, you probably get a 200 OK. Okay, I got a 200 status. Okay. And this is actually the web page of that URL that we have created. So if we do this in the browser, longest in the world, I'll be redirected to this URL, which is the same as what we have right here. Great. So our main feature, which is to handle the redirect, is working fine. That's great. And I'm just going to rename this to handle redirect. That's better. All right. So we now have the feature to get all the links, to create a link, and to redirect. We should be able to delete a link as well. So let's create that feature. So you should be familiar of what we're doing here right now. We just need the ID to delete the link. So as you can see, each link has a unique ID. You can use that to delete the link. And TypeORM, you can just delete using the delete function and passing the query like this. And this should be a promise void. So we don't want to return anything. We just want a successful response. And yeah, to handle that request with a asynchronous function, ID as the parameter or argument, it should be a promise void. I forgot to pass the type over here. Let me just add it real quick. All right, and this should be a delete request. So coming from the NestJS, delete decorator, and just return the service, delete link. And there you go. Easy peasy, right? Let's do a quick test. Let me just quickly get all the links. I want to delete this link. So let me copy the ID. I'll do a delete request. And this should be successful. Okay, I get a 44 not found. That's because I need to pass in the ID. So it's /links/ID. And we need to use the parameter decorator. Get the ID. All right, so that should work fine now. It's still building. All right, so I got a 200 OK. So let's verify by getting all the links. This should be deleted by now. And it is. All right, so that's what easy, right? Now let's move on to the updating the link. Again, let's do the same process. Update link, passing the ID. And yeah, so in the updating link, we can either update the name or the URL. This sounds like a good use case for creating another DTO. So I'm going to create update link dto.cs. It's basically the same as create link, but in this case, it would be good to create a separate file or a separate class when updating a link, because in the future, create link might update link might only support updating the name, but not the URL, or vice versa. And we don't want to affect the create link DTO. So yeah, it's good to have a separation of responsibility in this case. So although in this case it's just the same, but yeah, you get the idea, right? So now this will be update link DTO. So yeah, first we need to get the link. Remember, we created this get link function. We can utilize that link and just pass in the ID, which is a conditions object. Once we find the link, we want to extract name and URL from the update link DTO and replace the current name with the new name. Same thing for the URL. And this is actually not saved in the database yet. So we need to call the LinksRepository save. And we just return the updated link. So this is a promise of link as well. Let's quickly use that in the controller. Update link. We need the ID and we need the update link DTO. It should be a promise of the new link, the updated link. Let's decorate this with a put and the /ID. This will be decorated with a parameter. And this will be the body request, if you remember how we did it in the post request. Let's just call LinksService update link and pass in the update link DTO. All right, so everything is still working fine. It's all green. Let's do a quick test. Let's get all the links, copy this ID. I want to be able to update this. Yes, and let's just update the URL. Let's see what happens. There you go. It returns the updated link. And you can also verify via the get all links. This should be google.com right now. All right, it works. And just to quickly show you, you can also update the name, shortest. There you go. Same thing for getting all the links. It's also updated. So yeah, our updated link is now working fine. We actually completed all the features that we need, but we're not done yet. So next thing we want to do is basically introduce validation. So for example, I can pass an empty name, empty string, and that would still go. And that's not really ideal, right? We should not support empty name or empty URL. It doesn't make sense for our URL shortener. So in order to handle validations, let me introduce to you what we call the Nest pipes. So pipes in NestJS are a good use case for handling error validation or error handling. So based on Nest documentation, we can say that pipes operate on the arguments being processed by a controller route handler. So just before the handler is called. So pipes can perform, data transformation or data validation. Pipes can also return data, either the original one or the modified one, which will be passed on the route handler. So for example, using the pipes, we can actually transform the ID to become a number. So that's the capabilities of pipes. So pipes can also be asynchronous. So it can do a wait before the handler is called. And in NestJS, there are built-in pipes, but you can also create custom one based on your needs or use cases. So pipes can be on either the parameter level, the handler level, or in the application level. So we're going to add it in the application level in this case. And yeah, there's a number of built-in pipes you can use. I'll be adding the link to the description below for what other pipes we're going to use. You can use. But for in this case, we'll only be going to use validation pipes. And yeah, I want you to install two libraries, which is class validator and class transformer. So class validator is a really great package for, it allows you to use decorators for validations. So you can head over to the GitHub page. I'll add the link to the description below to see all the decorators you could use. But we're only going to be using a few. And then for class transformer, it gives you a warning when you use class validator in NestJS. You need to install this as well. All right, so now that's installed. We need to reset our Docker Compose because it needs to install that package in that environment as well. So while it is installing, let me just quickly update my create link DTO and use the decorators from the class validator. So I don't know why my import is not working fine. So basically, there's tons of functions you could use. There's isEmpty, isString. I'm going to use isString first. So we want our name to be a string. We want our URL to also be a string. And that's how simple it is. And we also want it to be not empty. So you can stack all your validators in one field. You can stack it here as well. If you hover on the is not empty, it's basically checking that the value is not an empty string, it's not null, it's not undefined. Great. And yeah, I'm just going to copy this in the update link as well, because they are the same. And yeah, right now NestJS doesn't know what to do with these decorators yet. In order to utilize these decorators, we need to use the pipe. So remember, we're going to add the validation pipe in the application level. And this is how you do it. You basically call the use global pipes and pass in the new instance of the validation pipe. All right, so after that, this compilation is done. Let's quickly test this out. So I should not get 201 status created. I should get an error. There you go. URL should not be empty. Name should not be empty. So you get descriptive errors just by using the class validator. So you can customize this if you want to, but yeah, that's a great feature because now you don't have to worry about error messages. I think there's a descriptive enough error messages, and you get the status code of 400, which is a bad request. So that's how you do validations in NestJS. So just to show you, if I pass an empty body, I'll get more error messages. So it should be, or must be, a string. Great. So if you remember, when we created the link entity, we specified the name to be unique. So what happens if I create a longest in the world again? So now it's successful. The second time I do this, I get a 500 internal server error. So that's actually not ideal for clients because we know ourselves that it is expected that we don't want duplicate names to be created. So how do we handle that? So you can go to the LinksRepository. So this is where the save action happens. This is where the error, you can see, duplicate key value validates under constraint. So let's wrap it in a try catch. Before we do anything, I just want to show you that in TypeORM, you receive an error code from Postgres. So let's just console it for now. What happens if we create this? So you can see you get this 23505. So there's actually a list of error codes from Postgres that you can look into the documentation. I can add the link to the description below for you to see. But if we look for the 23505, there is a unique violation. So basically, when we created the link, it violated this constraint. So we can now add the logic here. Basically, if the error code is 23505, we can show a conflict error. So that is available from NestJS. And we can add our custom message here. So basically, shortening already exists. And if that condition fails, then you can just show an internal server error exception, which is the 500 error we received earlier. So let's do a quick test of this. All right, we received this error message. So status code of 409 conflict error, and we get that custom error message, basically saying that our short name already exists. Cool. So now what else can we handle? So on the updating a link, we actually look for the links. So if it doesn't exist, we should get an 404 error. Right now, let's see. Let's delete this. All right, so what if you try to update this? Again, you receive a 500 error, which is not ideal. We should ideally get a 404 error. So how do we do that? Let's go to the LinksService. Remember, we're getting the get link. We're getting the link using this function get link. So let's extract that. And yeah, we can return it. If we don't find it, we should throw an error. So we can just throw a not found exception, and you will get a 404 error. Let's try this out. So instead of 500, we should get a 404. Cool. Means that our not found exception is working fine as well. Now what we need to do is basically do that for the delete link as well. So as you can see, if I delete this, I still get 200 even though it doesn't exist anymore. So you don't have to call get link to just implement this feature, because that will call or interact with the database twice. So like getting the link and then you delete. Ideally, we wanted to make it efficient, so we can actually get the response of the delete. Inside that response, there's either the row or the affected. So the row is the raw response. Affected is basically the number of rows or collections that are affected by this query. So if the affected is 0, means nothing got deleted, we can basically throw an error exception. So similar to what we did over here, and we can actually have a custom message as well. So link with ID. All right, so let's quickly test that out. All right, now I get a 404 error because this link with this ID doesn't exist. And for the last part of this validation or error handling, I also want to handle the ID. As you can see, this is a UUID. But what if I don't pass a UUID? What happens? Again, I get a 500 error. If you see the logs, it's basically saying type UUID is an invalid UUID string. So how do we handle that? So in this case, it is actually coming from the controller as a string. And we want to basically validate this using a DTO, so data transfer object. So I'm going to create a getLinkDTO.ts. And this is a class. It's just DID. And how do we use this? So instead of getting the single parameter, I'm going to get LinkDTO. So this becomes an object. And I just pass it to the update link. So same thing right here. This will be get LinkDTO. And instead of the single value, we want the object instead. And let's pass in the get LinkDTO. So we'll get an error because we need to update the service. This will become get LinkDTO. And this is going to be get LinkDTO as well. So we just need to extract ID. And get LinkDTO. Same thing right here. And now if you try this request again, I shouldn't get a 500 error. I should get a 400 bad requests. Oops. Oh, we forgot to add the decorator. This should be class validator. So in the class validator, there's a decorator called isUUID. You just have to pass that right here, and this should work fine now. Let's try it again. Oh, it's still building. All right, let's try again. All right, now we get a 400 error bad request. And it's also have the descriptive error saying ID must be a UUID. All right, so that's basically it. We're actually now ready to write end-to-end tests with this application. So I'm going to do it in another video. So thank you for watching. I hope you learned a lot from building NestJS, and yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.